We are at the Free University of Amsterdam, where, in the course of 6 weeks, the students who followed the course Business Ethics have delved into many different case studies. This podcast was made to give you some insight into what these students have been up to. What topics did they research? Which conclusions did they arrive at? And what difficulties did they find along their way? Their teacher is Professor Johan Wempe.
I'm Johan Wempe. I teach business ethics at the VU, and the students that did this project are bachelor students, third year international bachelor students, and they follow a course in business ethics.
The students learned all kinds of ethical theories, but most importantly, they learned to apply them in real-life situations.
What's better than to apply those concepts? So learning by doing, I would say, and that they find out how ethics in practice is playing a role, is used in decisions and so on.
The cases used during this course were based on real issues that the PUM Foundation faces. This is Monica Schreuder.
My name is Monica Schreuder.
Coordinator of the Text Committee of PUM the Netherlands. She represented PUM during the course and acted as a spokesperson.
We work with volunteers, volunteering experts. And what we do is we recommend and we consult at small and medium-sized enterprises in developing countries.
Over the last 40 years, PUM has been doing great work throughout many countries.
We work in 33 economic sectors and in about 30 countries.
You can probably imagine that this provides some great real-life cases to learn from. And that's exactly what the students have done. They worked together in small groups, with each group trying to come up with ways to deal with the ethical issues that arise within PUM's different projects. You will now hear 3 of these groups, starting with a group that can give us some overview. What are the ethical implications of globalization, and is globalization always a positive development? We've asked Jaap van Evelingen.
Our group consisted first of all of Minke Kliphuis, Emma van der Steen and myself, Jaap van Evelingen. And what we've actually been doing for this project is we've been looking at the ethical implications of the concept of globalization, and then especially for a management consulting company in specific. So basically, just to introduce the topic, what globalization actually is. Globalization is the process by which the world is becoming increasingly interconnected, and especially as a result of massively increased trade and cultural exchange. Now what you've been seeing is that the technological advances in the world have been creating more and more communication between different groups of people, increased transport and interconnection. Now, from a Western perspective, what you actually see is that globalization has always been seen as a very positive concept. We are increasing wealth, we are connecting people with each other, we are sharing knowledge. But what we identified is that actually this might not also always be the case, and that there are actually a lot of ethical implications when it comes to globalization. So the question we actually asked ourselves for this project was, by helping locals in a developing country becoming global, do you actually improve the local conditions? Now, what we saw is that the general ethical implications of globalization were actually quite a few. I already mentioned that we are interconnecting different groups of people. We are interconnecting different cultures, people with differences in norms and values. Now this poses some problems. This interconnection also means that there is a loss of local culture. We are trying to westernize local cultures, and we are losing their local norms and values. What we also saw is that it is actually very difficult to measure the impact for a management consulting company, whether this is due to globalization or whether it's actually simply due to industrialization or technological advances. And what we also noticed was that globalization might actually increase the gap between the rich and the poor. What you are trying to do with globalization, and what these Western management consultancy firms in general try to do, is they open up the third world countries and the third world market to a global market. but what we actually see is that it is very difficult for these local markets to become global and to actually compete on the global market with, for instance, large multinational companies. So those are the general implications and ethical implications. Now, if we look at this from a more moral perspective, what we try to identify are the visions of globalization and increasing these economic values, like we like to call it, is actually in balance with the actual values it creates. So what we identified and what we saw is that there are actually two types of values. First of all, the economic values, which are a very liberal perspective. We try to increase the profit, and that is what we think we are doing with globalizing a local market. We are increasing their revenues, their profits, by bringing them to the global market. But what we do not take into account when we look at it from this perspective are what we call the ideal values. And the ideal values are actually more the moral values and the values that are held in regard by the norms and values of a local culture, of a local community, which are actually very, very important as well, which research also shows, which we saw when analyzing this particular case. So, the ideals for a society. Now, what we see is that organizations, Western organizations in general, when they help third world countries or developing countries in becoming global, is that they look at it from an economic value perspective, and they generally ignore the ideal values. Now, this creates actually a very interesting discussion, because these are in fact liberal politics, but liberal politics liberate economic decision-making from moral values. We are focusing on the economic values, and we are ignoring social inequality and actually liberating personal and institutional greed by only focusing on these economic values and not these ideal values. So it makes it really hard for these management consultancy firms when going to third world developing countries. How do you select these projects? How do you identify all these ideal values? Do you relate them to your own norms and values and your own Western standards? What if they are not in line? What do you do? Do you try to implement and develop your own norms and values in these local communities? Or do you respect the locals and try to help them from their perspective in terms of ideal values? The economic values, those are, well, clear. I mean, that is not that difficult. But how do you balance your own human rights perspective, for instance, or looking at the exploitation paradox from your Western perspective in comparison to the local ideal values? So that is the main dilemma here, and that is the main problem here. And again, the Western perspective has always been, we focus on the economic values. Globalization is mainly positive, but what we try to identify is that actually there are also some side effects and some difficulties with this, and that it might not always be good to stimulate locals going global, and then it might be more sustainable for them to actually focus on the local market only. So that is actually the main and general conclusion of the analysis we did and the perspective we took.
An interesting conclusion, to say the least. This same struggle between local and global, if not Western values, can be found in the two cases that come next. First, we hear Yannick van Leent, whose group asks the question, what do you do if the practices of a small fishing company are damaging the environment without the fishermen being aware of it?
So my name is Yannick van Leent. I've been working on this project with Rien Schep, Quint de Kok van Delwijn and Adrian Koscielny. We've been focusing on ethical implications in the fishing industry, mainly in developing countries where PUM is active, the company we are working with. There are three main problems in the fishing industry, which is overfishing, unsustainable fishing practices, and illegal fishery. In one of our interviews, we found out that overfishing isn't really a problem in developing countries, as they don't have a skill big enough to really do this, as most of the companies are a bit smaller, and so it's more difficult to overfish, but they use a lot more unsustainable fishing practices and illegal fishery. As these people just try to provide for their family, they don't try to get rich, they just try to get some food on the table, make some money so they can survive. And they don't care as much about using sustainable practices as we do, as they often don't have the money or don't know that they are doing a lot of damage to the environment, as They often use nets that sweep the ocean bed and destroy all the coral, and they catch a lot of other fish with that either die and they throw back, or they'll take back to land but can't really sell and can't really eat, so go to waste too. This causes a rapid decline of the aquatic environment, and this all goes faster because of these practices. It's difficult to solve something like this, we think, but we think that with the right guidance from maybe some Western companies, or maybe companies local there, this could be solved, but it's difficult for people to know what is right and wrong, and we think that you should let your own moral principles guide you in solving this problem, and we hope for big international collaboration to make these people aware of what they're doing, maybe help them improve their practices, reduce illegal fishing, but this is something that has to be done all around the world with help from everybody, and can't just be done by some poor countries or some rich countries, and everyone needs to work together and be made aware to solve this. It's difficult to really make a big difference in the short term. In the short term it might be to quickly make certain fishing practices illegal, which might have effect in the short term, as some companies will immediately switch over to more sustainable practices if they are not allowed anymore to do that, although not everyone might change, because some people just don't care or don't have the money to change.
Another way in which local values can clash with the values of the PUM volunteers is in the ethics of labor rights. What do you do when child labor is regarded as a normal practice? Stef Gaarthuis will give us some insights.
So we are Stef Gaarthuis, Famke Plet, Jip Hoetje and Rensen Hollander. Our subject goes about ethics and labor rights. So the example is that we as consultants for PUM, we get asked by a farmer from Africa, and he has a farm with mangoes on it, and he wants to distribute it through whole Africa, maybe Europe, but he doesn't know how. So he asks us to help him with our knowledge. And when we arrived to his farm, we discovered that children are working on his farm. And this is our dilemma then.
Yeah, of course.
Because what are we going to do? Are we going to help him? Or are we going to say, we cannot help you because you have children working on the plantation? So that's the ethical dilemma, and here the exploitation paradox comes into play. Because the thing is that from our perspective, child labor is illegal. It's not possible to do in Europe. But in the perspective of the locals there in Africa, it is beneficial for them, because the children are not going to school or whatever, and if their children work on the farm, they get more money, so they can provide for themselves. They can buy food. So that's the paradox. Do you need to see it from our perspective or from their perspective? And then the article of Ferguson comes into play, because he explains that this problem can be solved by the weak non-worseness. And the weak non-worseness maintains that if you can everything for them will be worse when they earn no money. The question is more what to do as consultants, because not helping them will not improve anything, and we as PUM consultants want to improve something, and so we need to look for options, and that's where the weak non-worseness. If we say child labor needs to go away on the farm, then the children won't have any work, so no income, and that will altogether worsen the situation even more. So we need to think of other options or other plans. So letting the children work there still, but limited hours or just one day or non-physical work, that kind of things. And that's where PAM needs to look, we as consultants need to look at. And instead of trying to fix everything in short term, like saying no kids work on the plantation, just only grown-ups, will not help because the farmer will not earn more money, so he will not benefit from it, and children will not benefit from it. And if we go away, then he will get back to his own thing. So we need to think like in long term, and in long term we need to think like improving circumstances, developing for the children more, and we need to change the perception from their local interpretations to more international standards.
So, at first we heard Jaap, who gave us a view of the bigger issues that arise around globalization. After that, we heard 2 examples of more particular situations, like how Yannick and his group would deal with fishing regulations, and how Steph's group would react to child labor. What remains is to ask Johan Wempe and Monica Schreuder what they think of the work the students have done and the conclusions they arrived at.
I'm very happy with the results. I think they did good work. Of course, they are, well, halfway, you might say. So what you're doing is, of course, thinking about this topic in a more fundamental way to a program like this. So what is exactly the role of the advisor? That's the main question in that. And, well, then you have to cope with a number of issues, and basically there are no simple answers.
For sure, we work within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, but on the practical level, real life, it is more complicated to realize them.
I think important is that, well, each time you have to choose, but important is that the students learn as well that you can give arguments, that it's not an arbitrary choice for A or B, but you can balance the different values that are at stake and come to conclusions. Perhaps next day you need to come to different conclusions, but there are arguments and it's not arbitrary. It's clear that, well, a program like this, and especially due to the fact that they are able to focus on practice, well, that is really helpful to think about the moral aspects of all the decisions that you're taking in corporations, in advisory roles, and so on. Yeah, and that's something they learn by learning. They are learning that by doing.
In the end, the students were given a difficult task, but their conclusions were very much in line with the answers PUM was looking for. So, do you guys think the students could one day be part of PUM's team of experts?
Of course,
that would be nice. They are welcome to at PUM.